Hi, my name is Andrew Holman. I'm a researcher at the University of Minnesota on the St. Paul campus with the Turfgrass Research Group. Today we're going to be going over the installation of the WinterTurf sensors and the items that you need for installation. So what you're going to receive in the mail for the WinterTurf study is a box with your sensor and some supplies in it. On the box you'll find labels, one here, one inside there. This tells you what your logger number is. This will be important later on when you want to access your data and look for your node. That number is going to be important. So on your logger box, you will also have labels that indicate what your logger number is so that you can easily identify it when you're looking for your data on the cloud for which node you're using. It's on the top of the box. It's also inside the box on the mounting plate and on the sides of the box also. This is to ensure that we don't lose the label of the winter and it's really clear which logger is yours. We want you to save this box though, because at the end of the season we will be using this with a prepaid label to ship it back so that we can do some after season diagnostics on it and do any troubleshooting if anything went wrong. And also, if for some reason your cell connection was in a remote location and didn't send us back data, we can then take the SD card out of it and download that data. Now inside the box we're going to see there's a whole bunch of packing peanuts. These are starch packing peanuts, so if you are opening it outside, they will degrade with water and just rinse away. I recommend getting another box here so that when you're unpacking it, you can put them into that box. Kind of keeps down your mess there, and they're not blowing all over the place there. When these do get wet, they get just sticky too, so that's one thing. Inside your box you're going to be finding an extension cable for your solar panel. On the top there's going to be a handful of zip ties. Kind of loose in there. This will help for securing your cables. The two larger ones should be used to mount your solar panel onto your post, and then the two smaller sizes can be used to help bundle your cables together to keep them tidier and keep the site a little bit cleaner. Our solar panel is also going to be in there. One thing to note when you pull this one out of the box is check these little wing nut connections. They may have wobbled a little bit. But be gentle when you tighten these. They are only plastic, so if you try to really crank down on them, they will snap. But just make sure that they're snug and that they're not wobbling on your solar panel. And then the next layer, as you're coming down through here and getting rid of them, we will have your pieces of steel tubing that we're using for making the pilot holes, 1.5 and 3/4 inch. The larger diameter is using for boring the holes for your O2 and CO2 sensors. And the smaller diameter will be used for creating a pilot hole for the back end of the soil moisture sensor where that little red connection goes into the wall of your profile. There also are some solid staples in here. These are used for securing cables to the ground and also using 2 of them to secure your boxes to the soil surface. So this is the newer height jig that you'll be using for installing your temperature and soil moisture sensors. The shorter screws are for your 1/2 inch, your 3-inch and your 6-inch depth, and the longer screw on top you'll use to keep flush with your turf surface to allow for a uniform mounting depth. And then once you get through all of those top things, the next item that you're going to be finding in there is the actual logger itself with the cables connected there. On top mainly are the temperature and the moisture sensors. You can kind of move some things around there and pull your whole sensor out of the box. So your WinterTurf sensor will be coming out of the box with all of the cables and the sensors already attached. Our temperature sensors, soil moisture sensors, CO2 sensor, and oxygen sensor, along with the cable to connect our solar panel to. This is what you'll be taking out of the field and unraveling and then beginning your installation on. What might have shifted in shipping are these desiccant packs that are in there. These need to be placed somewhere inside the box, but to avoid that photocell right there. So once you've unpacked this, you see all your supplies are in there, then it's a good idea to start gathering up the other materials that you will need for installation of your sensor. So items that we're going to need for the installation of the WinterTurf sensors are first off a cup cutter. This will be used for making our main holes that we can put the sensors in. A tape measure so we can properly get our depths and our widths. A mallet, a hammer, or a hand sledge, some sort of a heavier object that will help with piloting some holes. A flat pry bar or anything else that's sturdy that we can pound against, because sometimes it's a little tight inside the hole and we'll need something to give us a little bit of an angle and an edge. We're going to need a 3/4 inch piece of copper tubing, which should be supplied or another similar metal with that same size diameter, a piece of 1.5" tubing. Then we're going to need the sensor height jig. This is so that we can have uniform sensor depth across all of our locations. It will make locating and piloting the holes much easier for our installation of our sensors. A flathead screwdriver or any other device which we can use to slide into the sidewalls of these cup holes to make installation of sensors easier in case there is some resistance in the green. Our Phillips screwdriver we'll have, and that will be used for our sensor box so that we can remove the screws and then reattach them later on. We'll also need some sod staples. This will help secure the box to the ground along with cables and PVC to protect those cables if needed. We'll also need then a post pounder. This we'll use for actually pounding in our U-channel post, which we'll attach our solar panel to and then secure the cables and panel to it. We're going to need that 6-foot piece of a U-channel post or any other post that you deem suitable for your location. If you have one on hand that will work, that's fine also. Some zip ties will be useful for mounting our solar panels and our cables. A compass of some sort, easily found on an application on your phone so that we know we can direct our solar panel directly to the south. And then other things that we're going to need, we're going to want a bucket, a piece of plywood, and maybe something to kneel upon just to keep our site a little bit cleaner on the putting green, and then also something to put our loose soil into because we're going to have a little bit excess from where we've taken some soil out for those sensors. And then a scissors or a side cutter to trim up the zip ties so we don't have excess material when we're done. So the first step that you need to do is figure out what location you're going to be locating this winter sensor at. Since you've been contacted, most likely it's going to be a location where you know you've had winter damage in the past. And the reason that we're putting these sensors here is so we can help gather environmental data to try to figure out why grass is dying in these areas. So for this first step, what we need is our tape measure, our cup cutter, and then a bucket and a piece of wood so we can keep our area clean. So for the installation here, what we're going to be doing is cutting 2 inches from the outside edges. So with your ruler or tape measure, mark off your first mark, and then one that is 7¼ inches away from it. These are going to be the 2 outside edges of our cups that we cut. Now that we have our marks that are 7¼ inches apart, we're going to be using our cup cutter here to cut 2 cups. One will line up the left side edge along one mark, and then the other one will be the right side edge using the other mark. This will mark our left and right boundaries of our cup cutters, and we then will cut down to a depth of 6½ or 7 inches. So after the first cut, we check our depth. We see we're only at about 5½ inches. So we're going to need to take out about another 1½ inch of material so we can get to our proper depth for sensor placement. So after we've taken out more soil, we now are well past 6 inches. We're at about 7½, so we'll have plenty of space to work with and install our deepest sensor, which goes down to 6 inches. So since we've got our first cup cut to depth, we're now going to cut our second one using our mark to line it up. And we can see right now we're not quite to the depth that we need to, so we'll take a little bit more soil out to match up to about the depth of where we were at for the first one. If for some reason it doesn't hold together, a hand trowel or your fingers are useful to help scoop out some of the remaining soil so that you can get everything properly to depth. So after we've cut out our cups and our grass plugs here, it's important to keep these intact because we'll be using these to cover over the sensor wires on the top of the hole, and we want it to try to mimic what the green's going to look like in winter. If you want to clean up some of this loose soil, that's fine, you can put it in your bucket because we are going to be using that loose soil for filling back in around our sensors after we install them. The 2 sensors that we're going to install first are the O2 and CO2 sensors. They both are going to use the 1.5 inch diameter metal tubing to create a pilot hole. The top of this pilot hole is going to be 2 inches down the sidewall of the cup. We can use a tape measure and the metal blade on it to mark in the sidewall where that is. And then when these are going to be bored out, one will go across the cup this way and the other will go the other way, giving us plenty of room for those sensors. So we're using this tubing for our pilot hole. We've already marked 2 inches down. To start it, you usually just want to twist it gently into the sidewall to get it going, and so it's secure. And then at that point in time, you're either using a pry bar or something else that's solid on the back side of this, that we then can use a mallet or a hammer to further tap it into the wall till we get to the depth that we need. We then can twist this and pull our core out, dump our soil in our bucket, and then at this point in time we want to measure how deep our hole actually is. We're at 3 inches here, and depending on which sensor you're putting where, you want to see whether or not you have enough space. So our O2 and our CO2 sensor here that we're piloting our hole for, we can see that the main sensor body of the O2 one is 4 inches, but we probably want to get to about a 5-inch depth here so we can cover this and we don't have a big robust cable in there. If we look at the CO2 sensor, we can see 4 inches will get us into the sensor mark here, but if we go to that one for 5 inches also, we'll be at a good depth to make sure we cover these connections and they're not in the main housing of where our cup is that we have to fill back in. So since we've got the top of here at our 2-inch mark again, we'll twist this into the hole to get the pipe started. If you want, you can continue to twist all the way in, but to make it a little bit quicker, we'll use our pry bar again and our mallet to tap it all the way into the depth. And since we saw we want to be about 5 inches deep, and this length of pipe is right around 6 inches, we know we need to leave about 1 inch of pipe sticking out of that hole, and then we should be at about the correct depth for installing that sensor. Pull out, put our soil into our bucket, help keep our area clean, and then we can take our tape measure and check our depth. We're at about 4.5 inches there, but we also can take our sensor and slide our sensor into the hole to see if we have everything covered. Since we have the vast majority of the sensor in the hole and just a little bit cable out of here, we are good here for our installation of our CO2 sensor. Now that we have both of our holes piloted for our O2 and CO2 sensors, we're going to insert them into the hole. Since we have a little bit of wiggle room right here, we can take loose soil from the bottom of the hole or from our saved bucket here, and we're going to be packing this around, in essence, where that cable is going into that sensor. This will help secure it in place so it stays where it needs to be in the hole, and it won't create then any air gaps, which could influence how the sensor is picking up that oxygen that we're trying to pick up in the soil here. Once we get that one packed in and feels like it's secure, and the putting green feels like it's secure on the surface there, we can then insert our CO2 sensor and do the same thing, making sure it's pushed all the way back into the hole there, and then pack firmly around with our remnant soil from the bottom of the hole or from the bucket that we've cut out before. And once we've got these secure, we can slide our cable slightly out of the way, and we'll move on to our next step of inserting our temperature and soil moisture sensors into the other cup that we've cut next to it. You'll have a jig that came with your sensor package. This right here is so that we can have a uniform height for all the sensors that are installed. We have 1/2 inch, 3 inch, and a 6 inch depth. Your jig will look something different than this, but the idea of this is that we can slide this into the hole. This flat piece will then allow us to keep it to the soil surface, and we can use those screws or metal devices to mark the sidewall so we know where we need to put our sensors. Just like the O2 and the CO2 sensors, which were set offset here, we're going to offset our temperature sensors on one side and our soil moisture sensors on the other side here. One side there and one side here. Sometimes it's helpful after you do this is to look into your hole and try to really mark them a little bit easier, because the sand can be a little deceptive on exactly where those marks are. So after you've used the jig to mark your holes, it's a good idea to feel along. Because you've got the smooth walls, you can feel where the indentation is. This will help you visualize too of how deep they are down there, but you can feel where they're at, and then you know when you start putting your sensors in that that's where they're at. You can also use your finger to clean it out a little bit, or use another device like a screwdriver to help mark them a little bit more so that you know exactly where they're going into the ground. So since we've installed our O2 and CO2 sensor, we have these cables which we have to kind of deal with so we have some space to work in our hole right here. We're not going to final button them up right now, but we want to keep them out of the way. So we have these sod staples here. One helpful thing is just to slide the cable out of the way and use a sod staple just to kind of pin it down. This will make sure you don't accidentally grab one of these and yank your whole sensor out of there, and just kind of keeps things out of your way since all of these wires are connected to our boxes right now. And that way then these are secured down that hopefully you don't grab them or bump them while you're putting in your temperature and soil moisture sensors. So our logger box for our WinterTurf sensor here has our O2 and CO2 sensors that are coming out that we've already installed. These 3 lines of ports right here are our temperature and soil moisture sensors. The depth that we want to install them at start here with, this is the 6-inch depth, this will be the 3-inch depth, and this will be the 1/2-inch depth. So we want to make sure that we keep this in this order so that when we're receiving our data we know exactly what depth they are and they're consistent across all of our sites here. So after we've installed here, we're just working our way around, and the next installation will be our soil moisture and our soil temperature sensors from this first port after we get from our O2 and CO2 sensors. So we have where our 6-inch mark was down in here, and we're going to use a screwdriver or something else that we can get a good grip on to pilot our hole. We're going to need to slide it into one wall here for our temperature sensor. And then in the other wall, we're going to be doing the same thing for our soil moisture sensor. Since the soil moisture sensor is much longer, we're going to need to be going almost all the way to the full depth of that screwdriver. After we've done this, we can check our depth with our actual sensor here. So our temperature sensor in the one wall. Looks like we're good. We've got the metal sensor all the way into the soil where we need to go. And when we have our soil moisture sensor, we're going to slide that one in there too. It's a little bit trickier. We'll slide that one in there. Now we get to this point here where we have that red connection. We have our 3/4 inch piece of copper tubing. That's included along since we know we've got our blade in there. We can use that to bore out a little bit more of a space in that wall there. So we've used the copper tubing here to stick into the wall, in essence to create a pilot hole for the red connection portion of the soil moisture sensor. This makes it a lot easier when we're burying and backfilling into here, that we're just burying cables and we don't have a big gap underneath this thing, which could lead to some pressure on it and breaking of that sensor. So one thing that can be helpful too is that if you want, line up your tubing with the back end of the soil moisture sensor. If you want, you can mark it with a pencil or a Sharpie or just your thumb, and know that when you install, you want to make sure that that tube is going to go in far enough so that this red portion of that sensor where all the connections are to it is going to be in that sidewall and securely in that hole. So now that we've bored out with the 3/4 inch tubing for this red, we'll try to make sure that we've had enough space in there for both the blade. Sometimes after boring that, you have to go through again with your screwdriver just to make sure that that hole is where you need it to be. And then we'll try again to slide this in here, find our pilot hole, and now we can see that we've got that space in there for the red connection to slide into the wall, so very little or no of it is showing out of there. So after we've installed our 6-inch sensors on the bottom, we want to start backfilling them so that the sensors stay in place and we don't accidentally bump them out. We also want to make sure that we're looking at where our 3-inch marks are so we're not accidentally covering those up when we fill soil back in there. So just take some handfuls of soil there. Yeah, help press it against the wall to help fill that in of any holes that we have there and keep that sensor firmly in place. And we can fill that till most of the way up to the 3-inch hole there. We can start filling in the other side also there. But here it's going to be key that we try to press things down so we don't have a lot of settling during the winter when rain comes in here. So just taking your time, filling in your soil here, making sure those cables stay tight into the ground. And then what we're also going to be doing here when we have these is we're going to want to start directing the cables all to one exit point of the hole here, so that when they come out, we have a central point where they're coming from for mounting our sensors and our box. So now that we've filled up the hole, we still see our 3-inch marks, and those are the next temperature and soil moisture sensor we're going to install. Those are the middle 2 cables on our grouping of soil moisture and temperature sensors. So once again, we're going to use our screwdriver here to help pilot our hole. A little bit more difficult with a long screwdriver at this height because we can't quite get it angled where we need to. And we'll pilot that other hole here all the way in. And we're going to keep the moisture and temperature sensors on the same side. We're going to use our copper tubing again to bore out a little bit more space for that red connection on the back of the soil moisture sensor. So we have our temperature sensor for the 3-inch and our soil moisture sensor for the 3-inch. We've already piloted our holes. So we're going to slide that into our piloted hole. Give it a good push to make sure it's nice and snug in there. So we've already piloted our hole for the blade of the soil moisture sensor and for the red cap. We're going to slide that into the wall of our hole and make sure it's nice and secure. And then once again, we're going to route our wires over to where the 6-inch wires were coming out here. Then we can start filling them in, making sure that we keep these snug and at the depth that we need. Depending on how well your root profile was and how well your cup came together, you're going to start to need to take soil off the bottom of your plug so that we can continue filling around these wires and filling up our hole. So we still have our marks for our 1/2 inch below the soil surface or the turf surface that we need to pilot our hole for our temperature sensor on the side where all the other ones were installed. And then on the side where the soil moisture sensors were, we're going to pilot another hole there. And then use our metal tubing to give us that little extra space. And we see our mark from where we marked it before of how deep we need to go. This one twisting it to help so we're not destroying the soil surface, the turf surface above it, and giving us enough room to install that all the way in there. And then once we've got those piloted, take our temperature sensor and slide it in there, good and secure. And then we can take our soil and moisture sensor and slide that one into our hole and make sure that that head is, red portion is all the way in there, push down. At this point in time, we're going to make sure we get all of our wires over here together. Sometimes with this one right here, I'm going to try to push these down or to the side walls since we've got some extra cable there so that we don't have to cut our turf sample here really thin to avoid those wires. So hopefully we can slide these along the wall, press them tight to gather up with the other ones so we can keep a decent amount of that core together when we're putting the sensor back in here. So over on the O2 and the CO2 sensor, remember those were 1 inch below that turf surface here, so we're still going to have to shave down that cup plug to make sure that that'll sit down on top of there and then fill in around here. So the next step of backfilling and then finishing off this hole with these cables all kind of gathered together, a single exit point over here. So as we can see, we only have about 1 inch to 1.5 inches of depth here, but our core here is much deeper. So either use a ruler or some sort of other gauge to figure out how much you need to shave off. So since our cup that we cut out here is still a little thicker than we need to put back in, we're going to have to trim it. Best bet is to just trim slowly and check your placement here since stuff will settle. Sometimes it's best to have it sitting up a little bit higher and then just to really push it down when we're done. So we'll trim that off. We'll check where it goes in there to see how deep we are at there, which looks like we're probably good. I can still feel some space below here, so I'll add a little bit more soil onto the side down there, and then we'll put our plug back into place. And our goal here is we're trying to get things so that they're nice and tight so that we don't have excess water creeping into here or air. So after we get this plug in, we'll work on the next one, and then we'll take some of that loose extra soil we have to try to fill in these gaps here, because our sensors are out here in this area of the turf and over here, but we don't want stuff sliding into these cracks and working their way that way. So hopefully we seal this up good, and then we'll get our measurements over here, and then on the other side over here we've got our temperature sensors that are running right underneath here, and our soil moisture that's running all along over here. So just kind of a slow patchwork here to fill this up so it looks as normal as it can. So here we have our second cup that we cut, the one that has kind of a little crescent moon on of it. We're going to trim this guy down here and fit that into our hole. Check our depth here. Use our knife here to try to match up our edges a little bit. Push it down. And although this wouldn't fly with golfers with the little dips and divots here, we're doing research, so just take some sand here, really just try to pack it in so we don't have a lot of movement. And then hopefully that if we do have an open winter, we don't have edges that dry down and get fried. So work it into our seams where the cups come together. And we're also going to want to work it right into where the cables come. And to make this a little bit easier, our first step here with these cables is we're going to want to take a sod staple and staple these down so they're not moving. If you do have some drier sand, probably work in a little bit easier in these areas. Slide into some of those cracks a little bit easier. But if not, you'll have plenty of extra sand from the pilot holes that we bored for the CO2 and O2 sensors, and just the space that's taken up with the cables that are in your hole there. So since this area is a little low right here, I'm going to pop this guy up and shove some more sand underneath it. And then that'll look good. Move on to our next step then. Now that we have our sensors installed underneath our cups here, we want to move our box as far away from these sensors as possible. We don't want these black cables causing heating or melting close to them. And so we're going to slide it. Our limitation on distance is going to be that 6-inch depth soil temperature cable. That's our shortest one there. So we have all these cables that we've put together at a sod staple here that we're going to then bundle together and put them further back towards the box. We've got a lot of excess cable here, so either the use of zip ties or sod staples will be helpful here to try to keep them together and away from the area. A simple zip tie here can kind of keep these a little bit cleaner. And then once we do that, one of the benefits too would be a sod staple to hold this down, so if we do happen to have a windy area where it's located in, these cables aren't whipping in the wind and potentially loosening things up or causing damage to the sensors there. And then we have more cables here, so depending on what yours looks like and how your site is there, how you decide that you want to keep those together is up to you. Since you have 4 holes in the corners of your box, we can use 2 sod staples to slide through there to secure the box to the putting green to make sure it does not move during the winter. So after we have our box secured to the ground and our cables secured, we need to connect our solar cable extension. This is going to charge the batteries when we have a sunny day. So we have our red cable that goes into our box here. This is for our connection to our solar panel we have sitting here. We have an extension cable so that we can mount our pole further away from the box. So the first step here is we're going to be plugging in our extension cable, making sure we push it in tightly until we feel that snap and that connection and the lines disappear. And then we will be taking the other end and connecting it to our solar panel, pushing it till it's firmly seated and connected and the seals are there. This will then allow us to run out our cable so we can put our solar panel far enough away from our pole so that's not going to influence our site, but still mounting it high up. The key thing about mounting our solar panels, we want to make sure that it's facing south so we can get most solar radiation possible. One other note is that this pole, if possible, should be placed to the north of our box or east to the west. That way we avoid this casting a shadow across our logger box, which then could be causing it to show differences in solar radiation coming into that box. So now that we've figured out where we want to pound our post in, we'll have to do that. We have a post hole pounder here. A hammer or mallet would also work. One thing to note is that if you are using a U-channel shaped post like this, you're going to want to mount your solar panel plate across the opening. This will give you more stability. If you'd flip it this way and try to mount it on this side, you'll have a tendency of that plate to rock and wiggle, which will limit the amount of solar radiation that you're getting and also could cause some issues with your connections or cause your zip ties to break. So now that we have our post pounded into the ground, we need to mount our solar panel. If you do have a little bit of extra cable, sometimes it is helpful to wrap it around the post just to kind of clean it up a little bit. But you do want to make sure you can get it kind of tight to the ground. And then you're going to use a zip tie or two. We have our zip tie going through our holes in our mounting plate. You have one of the U-channel posts that has a nice little wire fence holder on there. You can slide your zip tie through there to help give you an extra hand and hold it while you then fasten it onto the pole. You're going to want to then use a second one of the larger zip tie in your hole down below to further secure it to the post. Since we have our cable wrapped around our post, it's pretty secure around here. We could add some extra zip ties if we wanted to. One thing to note is that we want to leave this accessible for some troubleshooting later on if we have an issue. This only comes into play if there's an issue when we're starting up the device and we need to disconnect this so we can repower down the whole system. It is nice to add a zip tie right at the base here. Keep this cable tight across the ground so if for some reason someone's walking over here in the winter, we don't catch this cable, and just to kind of keep it secure in place. So there's 6 screws on the box. You're going to want to loosen them up gently, a little bit at a time, working your way around. If you try to unscrew one the entire way at the same point in time, you have the potential for cracking the box lid. So with the lid unscrewed, we can remove it. You'll notice in here there are 2 desiccant packs. This is the antenna for the cell phone. This is the cell phone connection where there's a light there that we're going to be looking for when it turns on. Right underneath this cable here, there's an on and off switch. When the switch is pushed this direction, it's off. We're going to turn it this direction for it to turn on. And when we do that, we should see a light firing up right here. Now we see that this light is on and flashing. That should then indicate that our system is up and running. We will see different colors of this change and flash depending on whether or not it gets a cell phone signal. Now to put this system back together and put our lid back on here, we need to make sure that our antenna's in the box here. We make sure that our desiccant packets are out of the way. And we're going to make sure that nothing is covering up this little solar cell right there, this little photoreceptor cell. This is telling the system how much light it's receiving from the area. So we have a flashing green light here. It's a good indication. It's making its connection to the cellular network. Now we're going to go around and just like we did before, we're going to gradually retighten the screws on the lid. We want to do each one just a little bit so that we don't tighten too much on one side and potentially crack the lid of the box. And as we notice, it changes from flashing green to a solid color. That's what we want to see. This will be an alternative method for turning on the logger or a troubleshooting method if you've gone through the procedure and you haven't gotten the particle boron to light up. So an alternative method is we do not need to have the solar panel attached, or if you've gone through and it's not working, disconnect your solar panel. Make sure your logger box is off. Then we can switch it back on and we can press the red button, and now we will see that the particle boron is lighting up. At that point in time, we can reconnect our solar panel, and then we can reattach our lid on here and make sure everything is secure. When we're doing that, we want to make sure that our desiccant packets are out of the way of the little solar receptor right here. So that finishes up the instructions for the installation of the winter turfgrass loggers. We'd like to thank you for your participation in this study, and we look forward to future research with you and the data that comes.